Good afternoon and bonjour. Before we begin, I hope you will join me in acknowledging the history, culture, and stewardship of the land of the indigenous people of this region, most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We seek to live in respect, peace, and right relations with them as we live and work upon their traditional territory. I'm Josh Heumann. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant, and I thank you for joining us on this frigid January day for this film screening and panel discussion presented by the Power Plant as part of this year's Design TO Festival. We could not offer programs like this without innumerable supporters. For winter 2019, our public program sponsor is TD, the Ready Commitment. We also thank BMO for their continued support of the Power Plant's All Year, All Free initiative. That way, everyone in the City of Toronto can come free admission and access to our exhibitions and programs. And also our government funders, Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council, and Toronto Arts Council for supporting the gallery's year-round operations. Hopefully, we'll see you next Friday evening for the opening of our Winter 2019 season as we present 3 major solo exhibitions by artists who draw from deeply personal iconographies to reveal complex worlds intertwined and shaped by histories and identities. We'll be opening Same Dream by Omar Ba, a Senegalese artist who divides his time between Dakar, Senegal, and Geneva, Switzerland. Witnessing by Alicia Henry, an African-American artist who's living and working in Nashville, Tennessee, and teaching at Fisk University. And Mapping Worlds by Shuvenai Ashuna, an Inuit artist who lives and works in Kingate, what some of us may know as Cape Dorset. So turning to today's program, we'll screen the film Didi Contractor, Marrying the Earth to the Building by Steffi Girakuni. Following the film, we'll welcome to the stage Zara Ibrahim, a human-centered designer and urbanist and executive advisor to Deloitte on civic innovation. And she'll moderate a lovely and lively discussion with panelists Jana Levitt with LGA Architectural Partners and Stephanie Hossain with Omar Gandhi Architect Incorporated. And of course, we'll incorporate some questions from you, our lively audience. Now, before we start, I also want to announce that we have in the audience Joginder Singh, a photographer who is based now in Mississauga, who produced this really stunningly lovely book, An Adobe Revival, Didi Contractor's Architecture. I only have this one copy for show and tell, which I'll return to him. But it's really a lovely publication filled with beautiful full-color photographs and some texts and quotations. It's available online, so after this program, I'm sure he'll stick around and you can find out how to secure a copy for yourself if you would like. But for now, if we could, let's go ahead and start the film.
Well, I have so many feelings right now, as I'm sure you both do as well. It was so exciting and incredible to spend 80 minutes watching a woman on screen. That was just really soul-affirming for me. Yeah, whoever applauded, we can't see you, but yes. There was something, and so, you know, there's so many directions we could take this conversation. There was something so beautiful about the East-West connection between, you know, her origins and where she practiced. There's something incredible about women. But the place I wanted to start, as I was watching the film, I was making all these notes in the dark, so hopefully I can read them. But the place I wanted to start was, there was something very disarming about how Didi is old school in the way that she wakes up with the vision. And I leaned into my friend who I was sitting beside because I was sharing with her that it reminded me of stories of Ron Tom, the Vancouver architect, who there's lore that he would be dropped off at a site for 2 days with a bottle of whiskey and a notepad, and 2 days later the house would be designed. And so, to both of you who are practicing female architects, I wanted to know what that was like for you, watching the visionary who just woke up in the night with all the ideas, sort of perfectly precise. How did that resonate with you?
I mean, I think with some of our projects, Omar started his practice in Nova Scotia, and I think some of those ideas resonate with how we design. I mean, we design in the landscape. We know both the Nova Scotia and Ontario landscape very well, and I mean, it's a process, but we go to site, we walk around, we spend time there, we get to know the people and the culture and the history. So just the fact that she's able to kind of come up with these designs overnight, I mean, it's interesting. She obviously knows kind of the landscape very well and materials, and I think that's in a way sort of the way we design too. Like we spend time there and we look at weather patterns and sun path and wind and some of these things. So like right away, as soon as you spend time on site and get to know some of these features, like it starts bringing ideas right away. Like, where do you want your dining room? Where do you want your master bedroom to be? Do you want to be cooking and eating as the sun rises and sleeping with the sunset? And
Yeah. Jenna?
I think for me, the idea of a vision and kind of visionary, I have a bit of a conflicted issue because so much of architecture, especially architecture lore, has a kind of idea about the creator, about the individual, as opposed to the collaboration that any piece of architecture takes, and hers certainly requires a lot of hands to do it. But what I think is interesting is that what I took it to mean was it was almost like a metaphor. So she would wake up at 3 a.m. with the idea or the feeling that she wanted, and then the hard work began. And you could see all the iterative process that we all go through, she was doing as well, and she just describes what we would call a party in school, she calls a vision.
Yeah, it made me think a lot about conversations about, what's the role of the public, or, and these are residential spaces, and well, not only, but we saw a lot of residential spaces in the film. And the question, and it's a question that's so personal for me because I'm so curious about this, which is professionalism. And I also wanted, in the spirit of architecture is a collaboration, and having the visual of what that, or the feeling mapped out and then manifesting it in the real world. That is a particular type of skill. I don't even know if we can call that a professional skill. I think it's just a gift. But there is something fascinating about the fact that she started practicing at 60 and has no credentials to her name in the space of architecture. And so I also wanted to sort of probe on that. Like, what does that look like? And what are parallels you see here in our context where that permission space is being opened up for others who have a vision to engage with their built environment? Because it does feel so of that particular context. I'm curious to know if there's parallels you see here around people who maybe don't have credentials, but really have a material influence on how our cities and communities get shaped.
I mean, I think at her age, and I know she grew up in the States, but I mean, being able to spend time in that area, and not necessarily, where she ended up, but being able to spend time in some of these buildings and witness, kinds of features people liked. And I think at least one of her parents I was reading was an artist growing up, so kind of growing up, not necessarily in architecture, but kind of in that design world, and being able to, I feel like you develop a certain, not vision, but certain things to look for growing up with people who are kind of in the art and design world. I think really helps a lot, and I'm sure helped her when it came time to design buildings.
Well, I think in this context, North America generally, and probably most places like in Europe, you can't practice at all unless you have a degree and a license, and so it's highly regulated, and so someone like Dee Dee couldn't exist, except in my experience, the only time I've seen that happen is on reserves, actually, because reserves don't have to follow building code. If anything, it's the National Building Code. So you can actually be a self-builder there without any credentials and, manifest a certain idea about architecture and design without having to be credentialized. But I think what I think is more interesting is that people who don't have the credentials, who are shaping our city more than any others, are developers. So I think that's actually a really interesting. They're not city builders. They're business people who make their money through funding buildings, making large buildings happen. And yet they don't have the credentials of city builders. And I think that's actually a really interesting thing to start to think about, or who are the people, as architects, we design for them and for the city, but the decision maker is the developer. So.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about who is responsible, all the other actors who are emerging as responsible in our city. So in the spirit of that, in the spirit of being responsive and taking, your vision, your dream, the thing that inspires magic and satisfaction in you, and translating it into buildings in our context, I found myself envious of Dee Dee and how she had a material she loved so much. I think it's a dream to find that and then experiment with it your whole career. And I was curious if there was materials or landscapes in our environment, and you can talk a little bit about where you practice, just for context for the audience. But I was wondering if there were materials that or landscapes that you're particularly in love with when you build, and that if you had the choice, you would experiment with for an extended period of time. So it could be here in the work you've done, but it could be the unknown and places you'd like to play and experiment.
I think here the closest thing that we can come to for materiality to compare to how they use mud and brick is wood. It's easily available, it's sustainable, and we've used that extensively in some of our houses, so you'll still see kind of reference to some of those traditional gable forms, but how do we draw from the traditional and make it more modern? And in terms of landscapes, we have most of the body of our work is coastal landscapes in Nova Scotia, and we're now starting to design Georgian Bay and Muskoka area in Nova Scotia. So really kind of drawing from those landscapes. But it's so interesting, looking at Canadian environment versus what can be done in India. Like, we have so many more challenges here to deal with. And I saw a talk by Marina Tabassum earlier this week, and you see some of those same similarities, like really, really working with materiality and the local people who know these materials very well. And kind of looking at how different things are in different cultures and kind of the informality of how they build there compared to here, which kind of goes back to, who are the people that are designing spaces here compared to in other places, and just, how much more interesting things can be, when you can use the local villagers to help make your visions come true, who know these materials well, versus what happens in Canada and North America.
Yeah, the idea of it, like the informality, is such a beautiful part of what we saw in the film. It's, it made me think of Louis Kahn, like the My Architect story, and, finishing the National Assembly building. And if you don't know the story, but I imagine if you are interested enough to show up here on a Sunday, you probably do. But in case you don't, it really was a community that after he passed away finished that building, and very much in the same spirit. And it's something that I think if we could develop more a more inclusive way of engaging people in the building process, there would be so much more empathy for how it happens and how to engage with and talk about it as citizens, right?
Right.
There's something really interesting about that.
That's interesting.
And Jenna, for you, materials and landscapes that you just love to experiment with?
Well, wood for sure. I think for all the reasons that Stephanie was talking about, and I think it's it's just becoming more and more important for ecological reasons and sustainability reasons. And I think, where I would love to actually design is in the desert. That's my favorite landscape, and I've never been able to design anything there. So I'd love that opportunity.
What has been sort of the opportunity for both of you to experiment with sort of this sustainable architecture or reclaimed materials? What has been sort of the most exciting and like fulsome opportunity for you to experiment? Have there been particular projects where you've felt that your buildings have tread lightly on the earth, either by intention or by accident?
Well, for me, I think my partner and I designed our house about 15 years ago now, and it was a house that no one would let us design, and for all kinds of reasons, like we wanted to plant all the roofs, we wanted planted roofs that you could grow things on, and we wanted to make a very small house and demonstrate how a small house could actually feel as comfortable and as amenity laden as a very large house. So, and we wanted to experiment with passive ventilation as much as we could. And so for me, that was a real turning point. I had taught a studio in New Orleans a couple of years before that, and it had started me thinking about the relationship in a much deeper way between landscape and building. And I hadn't really thought about how it was possible in our climate. So with the house that we designed and using, thinking about the land and the site, not just as substrate to put a house on, but as part of the ecology that extended out to the sidewalk. And what did planted roofs do, and what did it offer to the larger environment as opposed to just the people in the house? So for me, that was a real turning point in thinking about our environment as still, despite inhospitable days like today, still you could have a really deep reciprocity between the site and the building.
Yeah, it's a beautiful principle, like just within a building. Stephanie?
I think for me, there's no one project in particular, but with a lot of our work, we tend to, try to bring builders on board as early as possible. So, and working with trying to source materials as locally as possible. So our Toronto office is fairly new, but starting to look into, what stone quarries can we source from locally, and again, like the use of wood, exploring and experimenting with that. So whether it be, mock-ups, and you can do a lot with such, a fairly economical material. So I think for us, that's something we try to do a lot.
Yeah, there's something I just found myself really taken aback by how what she was doing was so of that place. It could not be of any other place. And it just makes me think of, I grew up in Vancouver, and just seeing some of those ideas of those architectural vernacular that was sort of born there, planted here in so many different ways in the condo towers as an example. And so I think I got really excited about architecture of a single place. And even the color palettes were just so distinct to that particular landscape. I wanted to just riff with you guys for all of the time about ladies in architecture, because it just got me so excited. And with all that's happening in the world, and I was recently reading a couple articles in the Toronto Star about women in Toronto who are trying to really elevate the presence of female architects in the practice. And so what's that like? What's it been like, with at different stages in your career? I think it's just so interesting hearing from both of you what it's like to be a woman in architecture and how you experience the dynamics of gender in this practice that has traditionally, usually we see, I can name 10 films, maybe 20, that's like a story like that, but men. And that's, one of very few that I can name, I can name on one hand the stories of women that are told in that way. So like, what's your experience like? How has it played out in your life or your career? And how's that changing potentially?
I can start. So I'm also involved in Building Equality in Architecture Toronto. I'm one of the executive members there, and we've been around since 2015, and we started off in 2015 to start to address some of those questions, because in architecture school today it is 50-50 or even more, breakdown between men and women. And once you get to the working world, something like 25% of licensed architects are women, and sole practitioners, it's even less. And why is that? And how can we start to change that? And to your point, like when you look at, any TV shows, any movies you've seen, even when I still meet people and introduce myself as an architect, like I feel like people don't know that many female architects, and they're almost surprised. So I get that a lot. And being an associate with Omar, it's been incredible. But you still get going to job sites. It's kind of an ongoing battle. There have been a number of times where I've shown up on site with a male co-op student, and they think he is the one in charge. It's like, no, you have to be assertive. Have to show that you know what you're doing, and really, I think sometimes you have to work twice as hard for people to appreciate you. And but then you meet lots of other amazing women in the field, whether they be builders or architects or designers or structural engineers, and there are a lot of amazing women out there. I think things are slowly changing, and I'm still pretty young in my career, but I think one important thing is to try to mentor other women out there, whether you're a man, you're a woman, doesn't matter, to kind of get these conversations started. So I think, and in a couple places I've worked, sometimes you see that, sometimes you don't. So I think that's really, really important to try to teach them things so they can learn from mistakes you've made. And anyway.
Yeah, it just makes me think that's not something they teach you in architecture school, what to do when you show up on site and someone doesn't think you're the professional.
Yeah.
Jana, you've been doing this for a little longer. How's it been for you?
I think it's a complicated answer because part of it's the issue of gender, part of it is the issue of the profession being very conservative, and it's a very slow boat to change in its conservative outlook. And part of it is, from an institutional perspective, there's been very few women teaching. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of full-on frontal attack in terms of the glacial change that I've seen happen. It is changing, but I think it's really slower than a lot of professions. Partly, a lot of it is financial. So as a profession, it's not a very highly remunerated. You're not well remunerated compared to, say, a lawyer or a doctor. So what I've seen happen is, there was more women who, like when I was in architecture school, it would be 50-50 in first year, but by fifth year, it would be like 70-30, 70 men, 30 women. So higher attrition rate during school. That doesn't happen anymore. It's at least 50-50, and it stays that way to graduation. Lots of women enter the profession, and then it seems to me now the big logjam is around having kids. So all the kind of embedded conservative ideas about what being a good parent come to play. Then all the financial pressures, like if you're partnered with someone, who makes the better income. Lots of times it's the person who has a professional job that pays more. So then you start to say, well, then if one person stays home, logically it should be the person who doesn't earn the same amount of income, because it's so difficult to have a child or a job or a house. And then it becomes daycare is so expensive, it's not subsidized. So like when I had kids, basically one income went to daycare, and that's a choice you make to stay in the profession. And then if you even stay home for a couple of years, you're viewed as not a committed architect if you're a woman, because you've made the decision to stay home for a couple of years, not be at work. And if you're a man and you stay home for a couple of years, most firms just don't know what to do with you. So those are the kind of negatives. I think it's changing. I think, people like Omar having firms are changing that, because I know he doesn't think like that. But
no, more like 50-50 breakdown men women between the two offices, which is
which
fantastic.
Is really
kind of unheard of.
Tough. But I think it's a very conservative profession, so I think it's very slow to change. And it just needs, all of us advocating.
And it's such a, I mean, the industry, it's so collaborative. So, I've known so many women who have gone on mat leave, they have to give up their projects, they come back, and I've seen employers struggle, and it's hard. It's like, where do you put them? Somebody else has taken over their project, so they come back and they're kind of the lowest on the totem pole when they return. So it's,
It just, I always feel weird talking about like women or men or other, like, it's as if it's a binary conversation. And I recently started rereading Susan Feinstein's work. She's the researcher out of Harvard, and she talks about diversity as an end goal is you should be suspect of anyone who says diversity is the end point. But anyone who talks about just and fair, listen to, is her basic thesis. She's much more articulate. I'm giving you the kitchen version. But I got really excited reading her work. She specifically talks about it in the context of urban planning. But I really like this idea of the just city and the fair city. And I think that's what we're going for, because I think, sometimes the conservatism kicks in when we talk about women in architecture, because it seems to imply that we don't want men in architecture. We want everyone. We just want it to be fair. And so my question is, I think there's some structural underpinnings that would need to change because it's so conservative and it's so old, that if you had the opportunity to increase the fairness and justness of this profession, what would you do? Like, what if you might have that power, you might not, but where would you start? What are the acupuncture points? Because watershed change, I feel like, is an amalgam of lots of small things, and then a big shove at some point. I think we're at the big shove moment. But where would you start to create more fairness so that it was a practice that welcomed a more diverse group of practitioners?
Oh, I don't know if there's one place. Going back
Or a few places.
to BEAT, we started with a few events. So we have talks every month at different local offices, and we've invited in a range of people, and people can talk about their practices and their experiences. We host dinners, same thing, small intimate conversations, and we've hosted Jana before, which has been fantastic. And not, again, BEAT is not like we are looking for equality and equity in the profession. It's not meant to be a women's group where we close all the men out. Like, this conversation needs to happen with everybody. So that's where we started. We're starting to work more with the OAA and REIC and TSA. We invited each of them to kind of say a few words at our event on unconscious bias and diversity and inclusion that we held in October, because I think they also need to be held accountable. Like, what are they doing to help this profession change? And again, we had somebody come in to speak from the Canadian Centre of Diversity and Inclusion, teaching people terminology, like what is diversity, what is inclusion, what is equity versus equality, what is micro inequity, and we can't have these conversations without knowing some of this terminology, and what does that mean for hiring practices? How do we change? Everybody has unconscious biases, so I feel like it starts by having people recognize some of these things. And again, going back to students and what's happening in the academic world, I did notice, when I was in school, there aren't that many female teachers. Our group is starting up a chapter in Atlantic Canada, and they've started by coordinating with DAL, which I think is a great place to start. And I think something they're starting to address with the School of Architecture there is case studies. Like, when I was in school and we were given a list of 10 case study projects, maybe there was one female architect, maybe. And, how many people of color, how many, what is, I'm sure, 80% of them were older white men. And so how do we start by changing things in school? Because, now as a designer, when you're looking for precedent projects, who do you go to first? You reference some of these people you would have learned from in school, and I think starting, making these changes early on is also really important.
I think it's a range of things. like I just learned recently, that one of the reasons why there are not very many Indigenous architects is because systemically, if you became a professional, registered professional, you lost your status. So there are systemic issues why the profession isn't as fair as it and just as it should be. So part of that is, again, like making it known that those exist and then advocating to get those removed. And then I think there's a kind of class issue. So it's traditionally a moneyed profession and an upper class profession. So I think doing outreach, like I know OCAD and U of T and I think George Brown all do research to outreach to different neighborhoods, different community groups all over the province as a way to get a broader range of students interested in the arts. So like you can be a photographer, you could be an architect. In communities where having that as even on the list of things is really unknown. And then I think we have to recalibrate what the canon is about what constitutes good architecture and how one experiences the architectural profession or education. So for instance, many people have a difficult time learning and talking about architecture in architecture school within the accepted means, which is highly intellectualized, word-based, not action-based. So if we had more conversations and more education where people could think and talk with their hands and make things, because part of what we love to do is make things as architects, yet in architecture school it's not nearly as validated as a means of expression as it is to get up and talk about what you're doing and provide a very intellectualized response. So if we could broaden those definitions, I think it would start to include a greater number of people in the conversation.
I love that you brought up the class conversation because I really think it's been something. It's been the unspoken current that has pulled people away from this profession. I remember when I finished my undergrad, I just all I could say every time I had an opportunity was, architecture is a human right. Architecture is a human right, and it wasn't that it was to have a space that feels like it dignifies you and the life you're living is all of our collective right. And I think reframing it in a class context is so important because architecture right now is very much for some and not for all. I'm conscious of time, and I also want to give the audience an opportunity to chat with the two of you. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we can open it up to the audience. But the question. This was the part of Dee Dee that I delighted in, which was when I saw her collaborators sort of dancing on the mud. And I just thought about how delightful that was. What a beautiful metaphor and symbol and ritual and critical part of the building experience. It reminded me of, smushing the grapes and it felt so beautiful and joyful. And sometimes in architecture it gets so somber and serious. Like we take ourselves so seriously. And so I just wanted to ask you, at what moment in your process do you feel that sense of delight and joy? And I'm projecting it onto all those people because they just look so happy. But it just seemed like a part that was necessary and joyful. And so I would sort of put that to you, like what part of the process is delightful and joyful, and actually that even as a signal of how we can welcome people in. To your point, Jenna, if we can bring that joyfulness into our practice, I think it's a welcoming. It extends a welcome to more people rather than having to be so serious all the time. So is there a moment in your practice that feels like that? You're allowed to say no.
I don't think it's something as concrete as that moment. For me, I think it's working with people. I love, whether it be the client or tradespeople or suppliers. I think that's, every day I get to work with my colleagues. try to help clients realize their vision, figure out and realize it, and doing site visits with them and for them seeing progress. And so I think working with people for me is the big one.
I think partly it's when you're working with some people at the office and you've got this kind of gnarly little bit you can't figure out, and you just keep pushing around the pencil and working through it, and all of a sudden you think, I think we got it now. That's always a really joyful
Right.
moment. And then when you go on site and you start to see the building take shape is always really fantastic.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I wanted to open it up. So, are there any questions? I see. We can barely see you, but I see a hand right here in the front, and I think we have a roving mic.
Hey guys, thanks for being here and doing this talk. I'm curious more about the eco-design part of things. So obviously with all the regulations and whatnot in North American westernized world, there's a lot of roadblocks with using sustainable material in some of the designs, whether it's for fireproofing or whatnot, or whatever it might be. What do you guys see as kind of the biggest challenge right now or obstacle with incorporating more of these sustainable materials into our designs and practices?
To tell you the truth, for me, the issue or the conversation shouldn't be about sustainable materials per se. That's a kind of outcome of a bigger issue with respect to sustainability, and that's where I think actually this film is very relevant to the what we're all having to grapple with, and we'll have to grapple with in a more serious manner shortly. Is all the things like build with materials that are close to home. Build buildings that rely on a lot of passive strategies as opposed to active strategies. So I think all of those, like having a kind of rallying cry about the bigger issues with respect to the role that buildings play or construction or architecture plays, is probably the most important conversation to have. And then out of that come things like, well, should we build with corn cobs? Should we heat with corn cobs? Gee, that doesn't really, the OBC doesn't recognize that. We better go and change that. Those to me are outcomes of the bigger decisions. Like if we are limited to 100 miles or 200 miles, whatever that number is, then you say, that's my arena of operations. And then what can I cherry pick from there to make a great building? And then you decide on materials, and they will all be, inherently sustainable because they're operating within that bigger idea of what we should all be using as building materials.
And also even, working with local climate and context, and, in this climate, fully glazed towers don't really make sense. Between the range of, weather today and weather in the middle of July, design smartly and work with sun and wind and rain, and then, some of those materials come after. But I think you really need to be smart about how you start a project, lay some ground rules, and then those things will come later.
I love the visual of sun and wind and rain as part of your material palette. It's just such a beautiful, it's very much what she was doing, but it's so nice to name it. Are there any other questions from the audience? I can't see. Okay. Well, I'm gonna take one last question, and then, I'm gonna offer one last question, and then we'll go out into the frigid afternoon. So there is something so that was so lovely, and I don't know if it was Dee Dee who said it in the film, but talked about the interior process of architecture, and that sort of, I think it was not her, it was someone reflecting on her practice, and how it really came from within. And so I think when you both need to sort of elevate your thinking about your architectural practice, what is your source of nourishment? Like what is, and maybe right now in this moment in the world, in time, where do you go to sort of nourish your interior process? What kind of things are really lighting your world on fire and helping you, you know, break through into new parts of your own practice? Like what is really exciting you, and in your own development, in your own, at your different stages in your career? What are those things for you?
I mean, I think for us, we're always looking at what other, looking for precedents, visiting new spaces in the city, in the province, traveling, trying to travel as much as I can, and just kind of see what other people are doing and, looking for inspiration.
I think for me, I tend to go to the fine arts, so I'll go see a great show, or like a painting, sculpture, installation. For me, that's always really nourishing. And then I love cities, so I would go for a weekend to New York and go see a great project and go see a great show and just go for an incredible walk. Like anywhere where there's great urban life, to me, is really, really powerful.
Yeah, and even just thinking in our own city of how urban life is changing in different, like you can travel to different cities by just, for better or for worse, visiting different parts of Toronto. But I know that, just after this conversation, excuse me, the spirit of a reciprocal building and to me, just that idea that it's constantly in a cycle, not just once, but over time. I love that. And in the spirit of all the other things happening in our country right now, thinking about every gesture onto the land being a reciprocal one, I think is responsible architecture. So I really appreciate that framing. That's gonna nourish me through the cold journey home. Thank you to both of you for just your insights and being here on a Sunday and having a great conversation. And thank you to all of you for showing up and being part of Design TO. And you should go check out other Design TO things. They're all amazing, and as well as amazing power plant programming. And thanks for coming out, and we'll see you soon.